I know I talk about morals a fair bit, but I came across a video by Jason Jimenez where he tries to make the claim that morals are absolute and somehow his imaginary friend is responsible. Now, this is a very common claim, but it always falls apart under even the most rudimentary of scrutiny, and I don't understand why it's so hard for the religious to get this through their heads. Oh, right, because their beliefs are emotional, not intellectual. How could I forget? So let's see what Jason has to say and why, as always, the religious position is entirely indefensible. Now, I'm going to stop it right there and point out that truth is subjective. And I'm sure this guy would disagree. After all, this is an entire video disagreeing with that very concept. But objectively speaking, we know that everyone has their own opinions of what is right and what is wrong, what is truth and what is falsehood. It's different if you're talking about facts, but truth tends to be very individual and personal. So I won't be surprised if I completely disagree with just about everything this guy is about to say.
Who does determine what is right and what is wrong?
All of us individually and collectively as a society. That's why laws are so different from place to place, from society to society, and from nation to nation. Because other than some commonalities that we all share, because we're all human and have similar needs, what we want out of life beyond that tends to be very different and shaped by the environment and societies in which we live. So there's the actual answer, but let's see what Jason thinks.
There are many opinions floating around about what is right and what is wrong.
And the fact that there are many opinions shows that there is no singular, objectively verifiable standard for right and wrong and for good and bad. If there were, there wouldn't be that many opinions.
With all the moral confusion in our society, it's difficult to figure out what people should actually believe.
Because belief isn't all that important when it comes right down to it. Most of the so-called confusion comes from people being indoctrinated into various political and religious ideologies instead of being able to sit down and think rationally about what's best for individuals and societies and what simply doesn't work.
No matter where you go, questions like these arise. Does everyone have the right to determine what is right and wrong? Is everything relative to the individual? Without question, relativism is one of the foremost isms of our time.
It's simply reality. It is what actually is. Now, that doesn't mean that each individual gets to decide for themselves what they want to be acceptable and have that be workable within a common society. One person can't decide that murder is fine and just go around killing people, and someone else deciding that stealing is a moral good and just go ripping people off. Societal consensus is ultimately the moral standard that everyone gets held to. You do what society collectively decides is acceptable for you to do, and if you stray outside of those boundaries, you get punished. And that's how human societies operate.
It claims that there are no absolutes and that anyone who thinks there are absolutes is absolutely wrong.
Which is, of course, not what anyone says. At best, people can claim that there's no moral absolutes, which I think is a defensible position to take. No one says there are absolutely no absolutes. This is a straw man used by the religious to get around having to deal with the arguments of others.
But isn't this one of the basic problems with relativism? Absolutely. Here are some others. Number one, it is self-defeating to claim that one is absolutely certain that there are no absolutes. The claim that one should never use the word never, just use the word never in that claim. Likewise, the claim that one should always avoid using the word always, just use the word always.
Again, nobody ever says that. You're just attacking a straw man. The speed of light is an absolute. But the speed of light has absolutely nothing to do with moral questions. I have yet to see a demonstrable absolute in morality. Maybe Jason can point one out and prove how he knows, with evidence, that it's absolute. Somehow doubt it, though.
Number two, the assertion that the world is getting worse or better is not possible unless one has a moral absolute to know what is best.
Wrong. I can use my own personal views to decide if I think that the world is getting better or worse. But ultimately, it's just opinion. Besides, what are you comparing it to? Better than what? Worse than what? What's your basis for comparison? What standards are you using? Why are your standards better than mine? And how do you know?
Even simple judgments about how good or evil the world is depends on some objective standard outside ourselves by which such judgments can be made. We could not say that more poverty, abuse, exploitation, slavery, and abortion would make the world worse.
It depends on your point of view, because from the standpoint of the slave owner, they might think that more slavery would make the world a better place. You're just asserting that your point of view is the only point of view worth considering, and you're wrong.
Or that more peace, harmony, and love would make it better.
Wrong again, because I'm not deciding what is the absolute best, because I don't think that's even a credible question. I can only make a judgment based on my own opinions of what I think is best from the currently available options. There is no single best situation. That's mindless utopianism. It's just fantasy. Try living in the real world.
3. Moral comparisons, which we make all the time, depend on moral absolutes. To even think or pose the question, what is the best, would have no meaning. How could we say that Jesus Christ is better than Osama bin Laden unless we have some objective standard by which to know which is better?
I don't think either one is particularly good, but you can certainly find people like the followers of bin Laden who would argue that he was better than Jesus. Now, Muslims, they're going to argue that Muhammad was better than Jesus. Go ahead and prove them wrong. Go ahead. Let's see you do it.
4. Moral disputes imply universal moral law.
If there were universal moral laws, there would be no moral disputes. Everyone would have the same views. But there aren't any more than there are universal traffic laws. This whole idea is just silly.
We can't say something is right and something else is wrong unless there is a standard by which to measure them.
Simply false. There is a standard, but that standard is subjective. Now, going back to slavery, there was a time when the overwhelming majority of people thought slavery was right and moral. In fact, Christians used the Bible and claimed that God wanted blacks to be slaves. And judging by the Bible, God sure seemed to be on board with slavery in the Old Testament. But that changed. People started to reject slavery as a moral right. That's why we fought a war about it. But you know something? There are still people out there who want slavery back, who still believe that God wants them to own slaves. It's all opinion, and there's nothing objective about any of it.
The point is this: there must be an ultimate standard that measures the two so that they can be compared.
Then point that out. Show where it is. Show how you came to that conclusion, and prove that you're right. Don't offer your own personal, subjective opinion on the subject. Prove that it's actually so. This ought to be good.
5. We didn't invent moral laws any more than we invented mathematical or physical laws.
Actually, we did. Mathematics is simply a language that describes observations that we make about the physical world. Physical laws did not change until we made the observations and came up with a way to describe them. And those laws change over time as we make more observations and realize that what we described before wasn't quite right. So we create new branches of science and new schools of mathematics as our observations get more involved. Yep, we made it all up, and we continue to do so.
Newton did not invent gravity. He merely discovered it.
No. Newton observed gravity and described it, and he wasn't exactly right in his description. Our understanding of gravity has changed dramatically since Newton's time, and in the next couple of hundred years, it will probably change even more as we discover more about the universe. Gravity may exist as a force in the universe, but morality? Please point out morality outside of the human mind. Go ahead.
No one invented the laws of logic. They are just part of the furniture of the universe. Likewise, moral laws were not invented. They were discovered. 6. Universal moral guilt shows there are universal moral laws. Why do we make excuses for our faults unless we know we are wrong?
Because other people in society hold us accountable for following socially acceptable moral codes. People don't like to get punished, therefore they will make excuses to avoid paying the prescribed penalty for violating the law. Do you think that there's a universal moral speed limit? Because when the cop pulls you over for speeding, people argue with the cop. I didn't know. I didn't see the sign. My speedometer must be broken. This isn't a universal moral code. This is something that a municipality just made up to make money off of, yet people still argue because they don't want to pay the ticket.
C.S. Lewis unpacked this truth in his classic book, Mere Christianity. Lewis points out that we are inclined to behave a certain way to avoid breaking certain moral principles we know are not meant to be broken.
We act the way we expect will be the least socially problematic for us most of the time. We don't want to be punished. We don't want to be penalized. Most of the time, we don't want our friends and neighbors and those around us upon whom our social lives revolve, we don't want them to look down on us. We follow the social constructs that we're raised with. And that's why Sweden is having such a problem with Muslim rape gangs right now, because those Muslims were raised to think that's okay. And the Swedes were raised to think otherwise. That's cultural conflict, and both sides think they're right. Prove otherwise.
Number 7, following moral laws cannot be herd instinct, since we sometimes choose duty over instinct, as when a person chooses to rush into a burning building to save a child. The ultimate demonstration of this is when a person sacrifices his or her own life to save another.
And a lot of that is evolutionary instinct. In that particular case, we are hardwired genetically to be protective of children, whether they're ours or not. And that's why you watch commercials showing starving children in Africa, and you feel really bad. In fact, the charities know that watching those children, and it's always children you'll notice, will increase charitable contribution, because that's how we're wired.
Number 8, we all find some things evil. For example, genocide, child abuse, and slavery are all universally frowned upon.
Well, clearly not, because they all continue to happen. If they were universally frowned upon, then there would never have been slaves, and there wouldn't be today. Yet there are. If it was universally frowned upon, the Holocaust would never have happened. Yet it did. Therefore, there are clearly people who don't frown upon these things, proving that these things are not universally despised.
But how do we know they're evil unless there is a moral law that informs us they are wrong?
Generally, because we've been raised and indoctrinated into a culture that, in general, thinks they're wrong. But if we look at, say, Nazi Germany, hatred of the Jews was very commonplace going back hundreds of years. Even Martin Luther was an avowed anti-Semite. Therefore, when Hitler came along and said that the Jews were responsible for German misfortune, it was a pretty easy sell. Granted, most Germans had no idea that the Holocaust was going on, but hating the Jews? That was easy.
Number 9, our real moral principles are not discovered by our actions, but by our reactions. We are imperfect human beings, so we don't always do the things that we know we ought to do. There are many things we don't want others to do to us, such as lying, cheating, abusing, and killing. So moral laws are based on what we want others to do to us. Jesus said in Matthew 7:12, "Do to others what you would want them to do to you."
Yep. That's enlightened self-interest, as I always say. We want to be treated well, so we treat others well in hopes that they will reciprocate. And that's actually how morality operates.
And finally, number 10, the same basic moral codes are found in all major cultures.
Only because all cultures are made up of people who have similar needs and desires. But again, you can point out lots of exceptions, from Nazi Germany to the Incans and Mayans and Aztec, for whom outright murder was a daily occurrence. Go look at much of the Middle East and tell me that their moral codes are the same as those in the West. They're not. Honor killings are completely acceptable. Mob violence is absolutely commonplace. Throwing gays off roofs, that kind of thing draws crowds of cheering fans. Someone here is not paying attention.
C.S. Lewis made a collection of them in his excellent book on moral absolutes titled The Abolition of Man. In the appendix of his book, Lewis collated moral principles from diverse cultures. What he found was that rather than being totally diverse, the moral principles were strikingly similar.
Only where they're related to things that all humans have in common, where you would expect them to have common solutions to things that affect us all. And of course, you can't look too closely or all the differences become blatantly obvious. I mean, there are places in China, for instance, where female infanticide is very, very common. They want male children because men are more valuable in some parts of Chinese society, so murdering your daughters as infants, that's very common. Well, so much for moral absolutes.
This included respect for the property and personhood of others.
Yeah, tell that to communist countries, tell that to Muslims in the Middle East who routinely murder non-believers and heretics. I mean, the list is very, very, very long.
As the great Immanuel Kant put it, we should not will anything that cannot be willed universally for all people. This categorical imperative by Kant includes the prohibition against lying and murder.
Yet it happens all the time, and this is a case of confusing an ought for an is.
So, in the end, who determines what is right and what is wrong? God does.
So who gets to decide for everyone? Well, my imaginary friend, of course. And who gets to tell us what this imaginary friend wants? I do! Because my imaginary friend doesn't actually make his wishes known in any demonstrable way. He leaves that to the people to write books of mythology and clergy to interpret those books down the road in any convenient way they choose. Sure, that sounds kosher.
You see, God is the moral lawgiver. He's the one who determines the moral laws.
Well, if you buy into the mythology at least. Of course, there's no reason for anyone to do that, and surprise, surprise, lots of other religions out there make the exact same claim about their own imaginary friends and offer no better evidence that they're right than you do. So at the end of the day, this is all just a giant argument from imaginary authority that you want to be in charge. Well, screw you.
They're not only written in the Word of God, as you look at Exodus chapter 20, but they're also written on our hearts, Romans 2, 12 through 15. Therefore, we are all obligated to obey such moral laws. So when it comes to aborting an unborn baby, which is scientifically proven to be a human being, that is an evil act.
Says you. But a lot of us simply don't care if it's genetically human because we're not inordinately attached to humanity. And of course, abortion isn't even directly mentioned in the Bible. It's just an interpretation by later people because it appeals to them on an emotional level.
We are not the standard. We don't determine who lives and who dies. We don't determine what is right and what is wrong, especially when it comes to an innocent life like an unborn baby.
Except every shred of objective evidence that we have proves exactly the opposite. We do decide who lives and who dies, innocent or not. Jason here is just emotionally attached to the dominant cultural delusion in the society in which he lives, and he has an emotionally vested interest in pushing that narrative to everyone else. He's never actually looked at evidence to see if his beliefs are factually true. I'm sure he doesn't even care. It just feels good, and therefore he's going to double down on his blind faith because to do otherwise is patently uncomfortable. But reality doesn't revolve around your comfort. It revolves around what is objectively and demonstrably true. And I'm sorry, Jason, but every single one of your points is just laughably wrong. You want them to be true, but you can't defend any of them objectively or rationally. You can't always get what you want, I'm sorry to say, especially when what you want is completely untrue.
Everything changes.